A recent study revealed that Norwegian Vikings carried more weapons and sustained significantly more injuries from violent conflicts, and that there are several compelling reasons for this. So today, we're diving into the fascinating differences between the Viking societies of Norway and Denmark, according to this new study. While many of us imagine the Vikings as a unified and fiercely violent group, recent research reveals a much more complex picture. We'll explore how geography, politics, and religion shaped the distinct cultures of Norwegian and Danish Vikings, leading to vastly different experiences of power, violence, and daily life. This is Viking History with Magnus. But before we begin, remember to hit that subscribe button, as if you were a Viking berserker plundering the British. Today, many people might envision the Viking Age as a violent society where everyone was armed, constantly engaging in life and death battles or challenging each other to a Holmgang duel to settle disputes. However, a new international study shows that the level of violence in everyday life varied significantly between Denmark and Norway. In Norway, violence was often perpetrated by private individuals, while in Denmark, it was typically executed by the state, meaning the king. This new study, published in the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology, is based on a detailed analysis of trauma found on skeletons, archaeological finds, particularly weapons, and a comparison of runestone inscriptions from the two countries. The researchers discovered that Norwegian Vikings owned a disproportionately large number of weapons compared to their Danish counterparts. The study concluded that the most numerous Viking swords were found in western Norway, with one found on average every 33 square kilometers, while in the Oslo area there was one for every 60. The least amount of swords found in Norway was in the northern part of the country, where very few people lived. There it was found one for every 1959 square kilometers. But in Denmark, which is much smaller and the population is much more dense, it was only found one sword for every 547 square kilometers. Most of the axes from the Viking Age have been found in Norway. While Danish graves generally exhibited greater wealth, Norwegian graves contained significantly more weapons, especially swords. The researchers suggest that the higher number of weapons in Norwegian graves indicates that violence was far more normalized in Norwegian society. This is further supported by the fact that Norwegian society was much more decentralized, characterized by local conflicts, and was a society where there was a need to carry weapons and demonstrate your strength. In Denmark, violence was more centralized with the authorities, namely the king, often holding a real monopoly on violence. As a result, violence was not as prevalent on a personal level. According to both archaeological findings and written sources, public executions were much more common in Denmark. This suggests that disputes in Norway were often resolved through violence between the two parties rather than through a court trial, as was customary at the Thing, where judges and a jury decided the outcome. Although Denmark was smaller and more densely populated, only the northernmost parts of Norway have fewer Viking Age swords per square kilometer. This suggests that the average citizen in Denmark had less need to carry weapons in their daily life. This difference is supported by numerous analyses of Viking skeletons. Among Norwegian Vikings, there are a higher number of random wounds and injuries resulting from combat. In contrast, Danish Vikings show fewer signs of this type of physical violence, but significantly more trauma that archaeologists associate with public punishment. The final part of the study involved comparing the language used on the many runestones found in Denmark and Norway. Danish runestones reflect a highly hierarchical society where individuals with various official titles are frequently mentioned. Norwegian runestones, on the other hand, depict a decentralized, clan-based society where family ties are almost the sole reason for erecting runestones. While in Norway, a family name was the primary indicator of identity, Danish runestones more often describe individuals with a title ranging from chieftain to sailor. The study concludes that the differences in violence between Norwegian and Danish Viking societies were much greater than previously thought. The researchers believe that this difference is mainly due to the fact that Danish society was simply more structured and organized, where violence against other Vikings was largely kept within a legal and regulated system. In Norway, the social structure was less rigid and more chaotic, leading to a form of violence that reflected this. Norway is 9 times larger than Denmark, and this made Denmark's population more densely concentrated and easier to govern from a central authority than in the vast and rugged landscape of Norway, with its fjords, mountains, and seas that had to be negotiated to reach people. As a result, the Norwegian king was much more dependent on his vassals to manage the kingdom, collect taxes, and keep enemies at bay. This decentralization also meant that Norwegian Vikings felt a stronger loyalty to their local chieftain, rather than to a king who lived hundreds of miles away from them. Consequently, the chieftains held more power over the king in Norway than in Denmark, simply because the king relied heavily on them and lacked the means to control them directly. This power dynamic led to numerous civil wars in Norway, with jarls fighting for power and wealth, making Norway a much more war-torn place than Denmark at the time. Another factor could be religion. Denmark was Christianized much earlier than Norway, and although Christianity has a violent history, the preaching of compassion and spending your time praying to God may have also played a role in reducing violence. The first Christian missionaries arrived in Denmark as early as the early 700s, and King Harald Bluetooth declared the country Christian around 965. In Norway, however, the pagan faith persisted much longer. The first attempt to Christianize the country was made by Hakon the Good, who ruled from 934 to 961, but it wasn't until about 100 years later, in the 1030s, that Norway officially became Christian. But even after that, many in Norway secretly continued to worship the old Norse gods, who were strong and fierce in battle and took what belonged to them with force. Instead of worshiping a god whose son died crucified on a cross, just like the Vikings would do against some of their defeated enemies. However, the researchers' analysis suggests that Denmark was already a less violent society than Norway, even before Harald Bluetooth became king, indicating that this was the case also before the two countries became Christian. So you could argue that the reason Norwegian Vikings carried so many weapons was because it was up to you to settle scores the old-fashioned way. One of the more colorful stories from the Viking Age is about the Norwegian king Eric Bloodaxe, who in one story chops off the head of a random, innocent guy. When the horrified people asked him why he did it, he answered, "He was in such a convenient position for a chop." Though sagas can often be both entertaining and excessively detailed, they do provide a vivid impression of personal character, dramatic events, and the Viking view on violence. Keep that in mind next time you talk to a Norwegian. You never know how close they are to their inner Viking. Remember to hit that subscribe button and put on all notifications so you don't miss my next Viking video. And I hope to see you in the next one.